Well, I'm just going to be continuing in Matthew, so we'll just pick up where we've left off, which is in section 4 of Matthew, as I've titled it. Jesus has disciples who believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. And really still we're at the beginning of that whole portion, so we haven't made much progress into it. We've been in the section of the kingdom parables in Matthew 13, or as I've called that, the parables of the kingdom for disciples of the kingdom. And today in that we come to not a parable, but to a teaching about the parables that Matthew provides for us in the middle of this sermon of parables. So let's go ahead and read the passage. It's Matthew 13, verses 34 through 35. It says, "All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world." Now that is, of course, a quotation. So I want to go ahead and read the source of it. It's from Psalm 78. And we will eventually be spending quite a bit of time there. So you might want to find some way to mark that if you have the inclination to do so. But to read the first part of Psalm 78, verses 1 through 4, it says, "A maskil of Asaph, give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell them to the coming generation, the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, and the wonders that he has done." Now, the title of my message is Puzzles for the People of God, which will become very evident while I call it that as we start moving through the message. Matthew's point in this passage is that the parables of Jesus are part of his messianic credentials, part of the evidence or proof that he is the Messiah. Contrary to what might be thought among Jews of his day, the parables are actually part of this messianic ministry that Jesus has. Now I have 4 points that I want to go through in this message and to tell them to you all here at the beginning. First of all, Jesus' manner of teaching could raise a strong objection from the Jews, which Matthew must answer. So again, Matthew doing some cleanup work, I guess you could say, for Jesus and his ministry. Secondly, Matthew's answer depends on this fact that Hebrew prophets very often taught God's people in unclear ways. So in that point, we'll be very much looking at the habits of prophets, if you want to put it that way. Third thing, that in the same line of thinking, Matthew uses Psalm 78 to answer possible objections and describe more of Old Testament fulfillment. So both answering the objection and then turning it into an argument in Jesus' favor. And then finally, Matthew words his quotation in such a way to emphasize the superiority of Jesus to Asaph, who is the guy that wrote Psalm 78 and is the guy Matthew is quoting. Matthew's wording in the way he quotes that is going to be very significant. Now, I've said that Matthew shows a greater interest in these kingdom parables than other gospel authors. He just dedicates more space to them. He includes more parables and more teachings about the parables. So he really loads up this sermon on parables, more than Mark, more than Luke, and certainly more than John, who doesn't even mention them. So Matthew has a very great fascination with these, and in passages like this one for today, we see some of the reason that Matthew has that interest. We see that it plays very well into things that he is trying to do in his gospel, and that's why he focuses so much on all these parables and teachings about them. So that's sort of the beat in Matthew's brain as he is writing these things and teaching us about them. So to begin with point 1, Jesus' manner of teaching could raise strong objection from the Jews, which Matthew must answer. And I'm sure you're all shocked to hear that people found Jesus' teaching objectionable. Sarcasm, of course. I'm sure you're not surprised at all. It is most certainly true. Jesus, every time he opens his mouth, it seems like something comes out which causes offense or scandal among his people. and very often we have to deal with those things. Jesus' manner of teaching in using only these parables at this stage in his ministry is part of that, because he has become deliberately unclear. And that is pretty much his mode of operation when he reaches this point in his ministry, that he is deliberately being very indirect in the way he is teaching. Matthew uses a very well-worded statement to tell you what Jesus is doing. In verse 34, it's kind of redundant. All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable. So you get very much the idea that at this point, when Jesus is teaching, it's parables and only parables for these crowds that have gathered there. And that's what the crowds get. Now, as I said, when we first came to this part of Matthew, I talked about this. This was not always the case in the ministry of Jesus. Jesus was not always teaching in only these cryptic parables. Jesus was originally rather plain in his teaching, so plain that he caused a lot of problems for himself. You might remember the Sermon on the Mount, a very lengthy sermon from Jesus, in which he is not at all using parables, or at least not parables like these. He is very straightforward and very confrontational in his teaching, getting him his first bit of hostility in the chapters that follow that. Originally, when Jesus did use parables, they were more like illustrations, things to clarify what he had been saying. Well, now, the whole mode of teaching is very different that we're in Matthew 13. Parables now serve to hide the truth from most people, not at all illustrating so much as they are hiding. You see in the earlier part of chapter 13, verse 10, the disciples came to him and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" They've never heard him do it to this degree before, so they're asking why. And he answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." Parables now serve to hide the truth from most people, and Jesus has taken this very radical turn in his ministry for that purpose. And if that were not bad enough, that's all the crowd gets anymore. I mean, just as Matthew said in verse 34, he didn't speak to them at all except in parables. So now all they get is this unclear teaching. It's not just he's been doing more of it, it's all they get anymore. So that is the state of Jesus' ministry at this moment, and what the crowds are experiencing whenever they go out to hear him preach. Now, the Jews might find this unclear teaching objectionable from someone claiming to be the Messiah. Jesus, of course, in very indirect ways, has made his messianic intentions, I think, clear enough to anyone who will bother to read them. But I think the crowds will generally find a messianic prospect teaching in this way to be very insulting to them. And to get a full picture of this, I want to show you the several different layers of insult that could arise from this. The first insult is simply this: the mere fact that you do not understand a word of what this man is saying. Just ponder that for a second, that as these crowds go out there to hear Jesus, they leave there with nothing. They leave there with absolutely nothing. Imagine that you were a member of that crowd, someone standing there. You've heard great things about this Jesus from whatever town where you lived, about miracles or how powerful his preaching is. You decide to walk all that way to hear him. Remember, you are walking, you don't have a car, and you probably don't have a horse or anything. So you're going to walk all that way to go hear this great Jesus. And when you get there, you get nothing but parables that you do not understand. Just a bunch of stories that to you don't really have any profound meaning at all. You're going to feel very, very angry. You're going to be offended that you spent all that time and energy getting there to get nothing. So the first insult is the mere fact that you do not understand a word of what this man is saying. The second insult is that you strongly suspect that a select few people actually do get the full teaching of Jesus. You have this inclination to believe that somebody in that crowd actually is getting more than you do. And of course, no one likes being left out of a secret. Imagine again that you're in that crowd, you're there watching all these things happen, and you know that Jesus has disciples. You see this small group of men with him, whenever he comes or goes, they're always there. You see that is the inner circle. You also see him occasionally go away with those disciples, into a house or into some private area, and they're there by themselves. You also know that disciples in general, when talking about rabbis, they get more information than just passerbys, like you are. You know that the disciple of a teacher is going to get more information than everyone else. So you have every reason to believe that Jesus is secretly explaining these parables to his disciples. And of course he is. We see in this passage several times where Jesus gives explanations for his parables to the disciples that he does not give to the crowds. And that should be enough to provoke your sense of jealousy. I mean, here you are, you've come all this way to get nothing but all these secrets, and you know he's explaining those secrets to some people, just not you, and just not most of the people around you. So there's the second level of insult. The third and final insult is that you are part of the people of God. You are part of Israel, the chosen race. You, the Jews, have been receiving revelation from God for 2 millennia. Ever since Abraham, and really, if you want to go back further than Abraham, you can. But really, for all this time, God has been talking to your nation, even as he's been leaving other nations in the dark. Other nations, they don't get anything from God, just Israel. And you're part of that. You are part of that nation that has this heritage of being the only nation to whom God speaks. And now you suspect that this Jesus might be the Messiah. The summary of all revelation so far. Everything that God has been saying is leading up to this point where the kingdom of God will come. And you suspect Jesus might be that. And you've been waiting for that. And you yourself might have a front row seat to watch all those things unfold. You might be seeing the final phase of God's plan unfold before you in the person of Jesus. And what do you get? For getting this front row seat, what do you get in return? You get, and a sower went out to sow. And that's all you get. So there's your third and final insult. Here you are, you're part of the people of God, you're at possibly the cutting edge of God's plans in the world, and all you get is a bunch of parables. And you feel like you deserve more than those parables. You deserve more than just a bunch of funny preacher stories. You came all this way to be locked out of the inner circle and to watch the kingdom of God possibly unfold while you get nothing. I mean, that's what you get. Now, thinking about it that way, you can really see how these parables could have been really, really scandalous to the Jews. To anyone who is even remotely interested in the person and ministry of Jesus, those parables could be quite an objectionable thing. So Matthew, of course, taking it upon himself to evangelize and disciple his own people, is obligated to answer such objections, right? That is the whole purpose of his gospel. I've been making that argument that the whole thing is written as a kind of argument that Jesus is the Messiah and telling the Jews how to follow Jesus after they hopefully become Christians. Well, when you have objections like this, you have to answer them. You have this big glaring thing that was really unpopular in the time of Jesus, probably would have still been a problem in the time of Matthew. You have to answer that. So Matthew, I think, is obligated to answer that objection as part of his gospel. Now, I think he gives an answer, but before we can get to that, we have to take a bit of a detour here and talk about something else. That is, we need to remember that the Hebrew prophets very often taught God's people in unclear ways. Once you appreciate that, I think you can get Matthew's answer, but first we have to actually study that idea. Prophets had a way in the Old Testament of revealing and concealing things at the same time, which is really maddening if you're trying to listen to those prophets. They have this way of being very cryptic, and it may not occur to you at first just because there are a lot of passages that are not very cryptic, but when you look at a prophetic ministry, there's a lot there that is very unclear. Now, I want to read 3 passages to you. One of them I've used before for this kind of thing, so hopefully it is very familiar to you. The other 2 are more like examples that I think are helpful for showing you how that plays out. The first passage I consider to be the classic passage on describing the nature of Old Testament prophecy. And that is in Numbers chapter 12. You can turn there if you like, we won't be there long. This is during the confrontation of Aaron and Miriam with Moses. This is where Aaron and Miriam come and sort of start dogging on Moses because they feel he is exalting himself above the people. Well, in chapter 12, verses 6 through 8, you have this. This is God speaking in Moses' defense. Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Now the whole point is that Moses is the exception to the rule, which makes him all the more special, so don't speak against him. But don't forget what the general rule is. Most prophets, they get visions and dreams and riddles. Only Moses really gets things clearly and mouth to mouth, to use God's expression. He's the only one that really gets that. Most prophets, they get riddles and stuff like that. So Moses is the exception. The general rule for a prophet is visions and dreams and riddles and things that aren't very clear. I call that the classic passage on Old Testament prophecy because it makes such a broad statement about how God deals with prophets among the people of Israel. So I pretty much always refer to that one when I get to talking about the nature of Old Testament prophecy. But I can refer to a few more here, which are good illustrations of this principle. The first one is 2 Kings chapter 7, which we can go there. We will not be reading all that chapter. I'll be skipping around a bit. This is the point where the city of Samaria is besieged. They're surrounded by another army, and the big problem is they have no food. Right? So the army has cut off their food supply, and they are slowly starving to death. You can read verse 1 here, just to begin the story where we're going to begin it. But Elijah, of course one of these prophets, Elijah said, "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow at about this time, a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." Now, I don't want to go through all the details and measurements and calculating everything and computing for you here, but I will say that Elisha has just predicted a great abundance of food. So they're going to go from a famine to having a superabundance of provision inside their city, which is a pretty incredible thing and is met with some skepticism. Verse 2, "Then the captain on whose hand the king leaned said to the man of God, 'If the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be?' But he, Elisha, said, 'You shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it.'" Now that's the statement I want to focus on here for a minute. This is a great example of riddlesome prophecy, communicating in ways that are not exactly clear. If this guy is going to see all this food, why would he not eat of it? Their city has no food. They're starving, right? If you see food, you're going to eat the food. So why is this guy, this captain here, who expresses this objection, going to see this food but not eat of it? You don't exactly know why here at first, and you don't really get an immediate answer why. You have to go through the events of the story. Well, you keep reading, God drives away that army in a very supernatural fashion, and they abandon all their supplies. So they leave all their food out there. So they go out there and they start plundering this camp that's been abandoned. And that's where we can pick up the story, verse 16. "Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Syrians. So a seah of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king had appointed the captain on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. And the people trampled him in the gate, so that he died, as the man of God had said when the king came down to him. For when the man of God had said to the king, 2 seahs of barley shall be sold for a shekel, and a seah of fine flour for a shekel, about this time tomorrow in the gate of Samaria, the captain had answered the man of God, If the Lord should himself make windows in heaven, could such a thing be? And he said, You shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it. And so it happened to him, for the people trampled him in the gate, and he died. So why did he see all this food but not eat of it? Because he got trampled in the mad rush for other starving people to get that food themselves. That's why. Now, think about it. That is basically a riddle. Think about that captain hearing that word from Elisha. I'll see it, but I won't eat of it. That doesn't make any sense. Even if the food did come, why would I not eat of it? Well, he found out why he wasn't able to eat any of it, and it was the last thing he ever knew. So that's basically what you get here. You have this kind of riddlesome revelation there from Elisha. It makes sense. It is a word from the Lord, and you figure out eventually what it means, but it wasn't exactly clear at first. Now I can give you another example. This will be my third Old Testament passage on this, and then we'll move on. This third example is very special because it involves a parable. which makes it very fitting for what we're doing in Matthew 13, talking about the parables of Jesus and how they tie into the common practices of prophets. Now this is 2 Samuel chapter 12, which is the well-known story of David and Bathsheba. Specifically, this is Nathan's confrontation with David after he committed adultery with Bathsheba and then murdered her husband Uriah so he could cover up what he did. So we can read 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came and said to him, There were 2 men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up and grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Now, I think it is safe to say at this point that David has no clear idea what Nathan actually means by what he is saying. If he knew what Nathan was actually talking about, he would not have been so hasty to pronounce a death sentence on the culprit in the story. So at the very first here, Nathan is not being very direct with David, is he? He's kind of coming at it from a side angle here in showing David his wrongdoing. Well, then it gets pretty clear. Verse 7, we'll read through verse 10. Nathan said to David, You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. And I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord, to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah to be your wife. So, at that point, Nathan's meaning gets very, very clear. But at first it was not clear. Nathan kind of used this parable to approach David in this very indirect way, and then only later did it become clear. From all that I've seen, from all that I've said, you can see that the Hebrew prophets very often taught God's people in unclear ways. They don't always come at you and say, Thus says the Lord, bleh, and just say exactly what they mean. They come at you with these very indirect, very riddlesome things. Now, of course, prophets sometimes speak very directly. I'm not saying they never do, but if a prophet does appear, you can expect him, at least very, very often, to speak to you in these ways that are very hard to understand. Now, that observation will actually help us to make sense of what Matthew does to explain the parables of Jesus. So that is where we're going next, and we'll tie all this together. Matthew uses Psalm 78 to answer possible objections and describe more Old Testament fulfillment. Now, the very thing which might have been objectionable is the very thing the Jews should have found compelling. Matthew's going to turn this around. He's going to say this thing you don't like so much about Jesus is actually a testament to how much he is the Messiah. It's actually part of the messianic argument. And we're going to go to Psalm 78. We'll be there for quite a bit, looking at some of these details. You might be going back and forth between there and Matthew 13, so you might reserve both places or just stay in one. It doesn't really matter. I'll try to be as express as possible. Now, Asaph, the author of Psalm 78, is a prophet. You see there the reference that Psalm 78 is a maskil of Asaph. And Asaph, when you read the rest of the Old Testament, you learn that he was a choir leader in the days of David. So he's one of these men that officiates over the musical worship of the temple or the tabernacle. There's a scene where David is preparing all this stuff for the temple that is going to be built, and Asaph is part of that. But also, Asaph is referred to as a prophet. And you can see this in 1 Chronicles 25, which I'll just read to you briefly. This is verses 1 through 2. David and the chiefs of the service also set apart for the service the sons of Asaph, and of Heman, and of Jeduthun, who prophesied with lyres, with harps, and with cymbals. The list of those who did the work and of their duties was this: of the sons of Asaph, Zachar, Joseph, Nethaniah, and Asherela, sons of Asaph, under the direction of Asaph, who prophesied under the direction of the king. So you get the idea, it's kind of a musical prophet. It's not the only time we encounter men like that in the Old Testament. It is kind of strange, but it's there. Musical prophets. So he's a man there prophesying with musical accompaniment, and that is who Asaph is. Now, Asaph, being a prophet, here in Psalm 78, he gives you yet another example of riddlesome speech, unclear speech from a prophet. Let's read the first few verses of his psalm again. He says, "Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell them to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might, and the wonders that he has done." Now, Asaph says that he will speak in a parable. That is the word he uses. Now, toward the beginning of Matthew 13, I made a great effort to prove to you that parables are more than just stories. I spent a whole message going through everything that is called a parable in the Bible to try to get the broad perspective of what a parable is, and especially how they are more than just stories. Now, one of my motivations for laboring that point the way I did was to help you understand this statement from Asaph. Because this statement from Asaph doesn't make a whole lot of sense if when you think parable, you think only about stories. Because this psalm that he gives you is not by any means a classic story parable. It's not like what Jesus is doing in Matthew 13. It's not the same kind of parable. But that's okay because parables have a very broad meaning to them. My definition was that a parable is a statement that is there to capture your attention and provoke your thought. So it's a very thought-provoking, gripping way of speaking, which had many different variations, as I spent that whole message talking about. So you might find it a little weird that Matthew takes this passage about a parable when the parable isn't really what Jesus is doing, but you got to remember, parable is a broad category. So you have to have that in your mind. Now, Asaph, he tells you specifically what he means by a parable, because he gives you a nice little bit of parallelism here. He says, "I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old." So when Asaph means a parable, he's talking about a dark saying. Now, I've talked about that phrase before. It is actually the same word that is sometimes translated as riddle in the Old Testament. So very much a connection to this whole riddlesome idea of Old Testament prophecy. So you have Psalm 78. Asaph tells you at the very beginning, he's going to give you this parabolic, riddlesome teaching. So he tells you specifically as a prophet, that's what he's going to do. Now, in quoting this passage, Matthew shows that the parables of Jesus follow accepted prophetic practice. Jesus is falling in line with what other prophets have done in the past. Jesus speaks in parables, right? He got a whole chapter full of parables. His disciples are confused. Why are you speaking to them in parables? The crowd possibly angry that all they're getting is these parables. These parables are very difficult to understand. We've been working very hard with them, trying to make sense of them. Jesus says they're there to hide the truth. I mean, the Jews might use this very, very unclear way of teaching as an excuse to just disregard Jesus. They're like, yeah, I heard about Jesus. I went out there to see what he was like. He was just telling a bunch of stories. Didn't really get anything out of it. I think he's just some weird guy. Well, Matthew demonstrates that the method of Jesus was used by at least one other prophet, that prophet being Asaph, who also spoke in very unclear, very riddlesome ways, these dark sayings. Now, it's true again, the parables of Asaph are not like the parables of Jesus. They're not stories, but that's okay because Asaph is still using these dark sayings, these unclear, indirect ways of speaking, just like other prophets were also doing, and Jesus himself is falling in line with that. In quoting the psalm, Matthew creates a connection between what Jesus was doing in his day and what other Old Testament prophets like Asaph were doing back in that day. So Jesus is actually following a very standard prophetic practice in speaking in ways that are not very clear, ways that make people wonder what's going on. Now that's so far so good. It shows that Jesus isn't doing anything really strange from a scriptural perspective, but what about fulfillment? Matthew says that Jesus fulfills this scripture when he starts teaching in parables. Well, how do we make sense of that? Right? I mean, it's not a prediction. Asaph doesn't tell you anything about what the Messiah is going to do in the future. Asaph tells you what he is going to do in this psalm at the moment. So it's not a foretelling of the future by any means. And of course you have the question, how can you fulfill something that isn't really predicting the future? We've seen this several different times in Matthew. We've gotten used to this kind of thing, so it's probably not so surprising to you anymore. But we still have to figure out, what does Matthew mean by fulfillment? How is he fulfilling this action that was undertaken by Asaph? Well, I think he fulfills it because he maximizes the concept of the riddle-telling prophet. That would be my answer to you. Jesus fulfills what Asaph was doing because Jesus does it to the best possible degree. Better than Asaph ever could have done, better than any Old Testament prophet could have done. So let's just think about this. Asaph says that Psalm 78 will be a parable of dark sayings. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Psalm 78, but I'd recommend going home and reading it because it's not exactly the hardest passage in the Old Testament. I mean, yeah, there's stuff in it like any other passage you got to work through, but by and large, I've seen more difficult prophecies. I mean, there's stuff in the Old Testament that has stumped me for years. Psalm 78 I can deal with. So Asaph, he gets up there, he says he's going to speak in a parable, he says he's going to use dark sayings, but he didn't really do a stellar job of that so much, right? I mean, it's a very, very low-level parable, very, very low-level dark saying. It could get a lot worse. Jesus, however, is the master of parables and the master of making them difficult, the master of getting up there, telling truth to a whole crowd of people, and none of them get it. The disciples even have a hard time. We, all these years later, with all of our study, we still have a problem with them. Jesus is great at the dark sayings. He's great at being riddlesome when he wants to be riddlesome. He can really do that very well. So Jesus, you might say, he fulfills that passage by Asaph in that he does it to the best possible degree. Jesus has done this better than any prophet could have ever done. Better than Asaph, better than Isaiah, better than anyone else. Jesus fulfills the idea of the riddle-telling prophet. The parables of Jesus, therefore, are a sign that Jesus is the Messiah. They actually play into that. They're not contrary to the idea that Jesus is the Messiah. They're actually part of that. Now, if you remember, I have summarized this whole fourth section of Matthew as the disciples believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. We haven't really seen a whole lot of signs, have we? We've been talking about all these parables, right? Maybe you've been wondering, where are these signs that the disciples are believing? Well, in a sense, the parables of Jesus are the first sign in this section. It took a long time for me to get to this point, but it's not my fault Matthew put it so late in the passage, so I'm just following the rules here. These parables are the first sign of Jesus being the Messiah in this section. When God sends prophets, they come with unclear speech. You should expect that. When the prophet shows up, don't expect it to be easy. So the Jews had no good reason to think the Messiah would be any different. Here is the ultimate messenger from God. Here is the ultimate representative of the Lord. Did you really expect him to be straightforward in everything? Would you at least expect the possibility that he might also be somewhat riddlesome in himself, like all the other prophets that came before him? Given the Old Testament practices of prophets, the Jews should have expected a Messiah who was at least as riddlesome as any other prophet. They should have at least expected that much. And since it's the Messiah, since it's the capstone of all of God's dealings in the world, you might have even expected an even greater prophet. One that's even more riddlesome, one that's even more difficult. So maybe even thinking in that way, you should expect the Messiah to be as difficult and frustrating as Jesus is being right now in preaching these parables. In this way, the parables are a sign that Jesus is the Messiah. He falls right in line with what the Jews should have been expecting, even though they were not. Now, in this way, Matthew uses Psalm 78 to do two things. He answers the objections, but he also uses it as an argument that Jesus is the Messiah. So he kind of does two things at once, does a 180 turntable type argument on them. Now, there's one more thing we need to do. This is the ultra tedious part of the message, but I think it really does help to think about these things. Matthew words his quotation in such a way to emphasize the superiority of Jesus to Asaph, which I know is a very lengthy thing to say, but Matthew words this quotation in a very particular way, and his whole purpose in doing that is to show you that Jesus is better than Asaph at what they do, at what prophets do. Now, as perhaps you have also come to expect, Matthew's wording of his quotation has some oddities to it. We very often come to these quotations of the Old Testament in Matthew and discover that Matthew seems to be doing his own thing, not really giving a straightforward quotation, word for word of what the Old Testament says. And we start to wonder, why does he do that? Why does he make it so hard? Why does he make it so we have to argue with all the skeptics 2,000 years later about how he quotes the Old Testament? Why does he do this? Well, Matthew always has some kind of meaning behind that. And I think here it is the same exact way. Matthew has meaning behind the way he quotes the passage. And here's what I would say. Matthew's point is that Jesus tells more parables, more forcefully, about truth more ancient. That is how I would summarize all of the details that Matthew alters in his Old Testament quotation. Let's go through them point by point. The first thing is that Jesus tells more parables than Asaph. And you might have noticed this, maybe not. You might have noticed a difference between Psalm 78 and Matthew 13. Asaph says that he will speak in a parable. If you go back to Psalm 78, he says, I will speak in a parable. That is one parable, just one. When Matthew quotes the passage, it says parables, plural, more than one. There's an S at the end. So Matthew, when he quotes the passage, he changes it from a singular parable into multiple parables. Now, let's ask the question, why would Matthew do that? Well, I think Matthew's reasoning is to remind the reader subtly that Jesus told more parables than Asaph. We have several psalms from Asaph in the Old Testament. I don't remember counting them actually, but there are several psalms that are a psalm of Asaph. Only one of them is called a parable. Only one of them has this kind of dark saying approach that he tries to take. Well, so Asaph has one parable. How many does Jesus have? Jesus has a lot of parables. He is known as a teacher of parables. At this point in his ministry, he adopts that as his standard method. So Jesus very much has plural parables, whereas Asaph only had the one. I think Matthew changes the word from singular to plural as a subtle reminder of that. And I think Matthew has good reason to remind you of that and change it to a plural parables because of what he's trying to do. Remember that these parables, being a kind of indirect, somewhat more difficult way of speaking, are the hallmark of a prophet. They're what makes a prophet a prophet when he comes speaking in this way. Well, Jesus makes abundant use of that method of speaking, right? He makes abundant use of parables, which would make Jesus the prophet par excellence. The prophet who has the most parables wins, and Jesus wins because he has at least more than Asaph. So Matthew, I think, has a good reason to change that from singular to plural. That's what I think he's doing there. Now we have a second strange detail. Well, actually two that we're putting together. And this one, I think, Matthew's trying to say that the parables of Jesus are also more forceful revelation than the Psalm of Asaph. That is, they come across with more power. Now, there are two oddities here that I'm combining. One oddity is that Matthew actually replaces the phrase dark saying with things hidden. Asaph says he's going to use dark sayings. Matthew says he's going to teach things hidden, which you might say, okay, big deal, but it's still a change. It's still different than a word-for-word translation or quotation from Asaph. The other oddity is that Matthew uses a very strange word for utter. When he says here, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter what has been hidden from the foundation of the world. He uses a word there. It's not the word used whenever the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into Greek. He uses a different word. The word he uses is eurugamai, which is a kind of a strange word because it's only used here in the New Testament, and in the rest of Greek literature, it's also pretty rare too. So he chose just a very strange word to use as he was doing his own translation and his own wording of this passage. Now, I think when you put those two words together, you get a very forceful image, which is what I think Matthew's point is. On the one hand, you have this word for utter, eurugamai. It originally meant to spew or to belch. I kid you not. It means to spew something out of your mouth or even to burp. I mean, that was the original meaning of the word. My lexicon gives this meaning for the later New Testament period, to express forcefully. Not just to say something, but to really, ram it forward. You're going to express yourself forcefully. You're going to spew out what you're going to say. You're going to belch it out, to use that word. So that's the word Matthew uses. Now, this spewing forth that Jesus does with these parables is even more notable because they are things hidden, right? They are things that God has kept secret. They've been in the dark for a while. And now they're being brought forth. But now these things that have been hidden, they're not just brought forth, they're brought rushing forth. They're being spewed forth. It's almost like when you have like a dam, water building up behind it, and more water is back there, and then it gets to be too much, and the dam breaks and it just comes rushing forth. It's like that. You have these truths that have been hidden. God has been keeping them secret, but now these secret truths just come spewing forth out of Jesus' mouth through these parables. It creates a very forceful image. I think Matthew has worded his quotation in such a way to point that out to you. Asaph, he spoke in riddles, but Jesus spewed forth hidden secrets. That's the contrast. So he does something a little more forcefully than Asaph did. So there's the second thing. One more of these details with the way Matthew words himself. The parables of Jesus reveal truth more ancient than Asaph's truth. Now in Psalm 78, Asaph says that he will speak riddles from of old. That is the phrase he uses, from of old. So from a long time ago. Now that phrase is very vague. It's not really clear what he means by that, how far back he's going, how old these secrets are. In context, it probably just refers to some point in human history. And you can see that from the context. You go back to Psalm 78, he says, I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known that our fathers have told us, right? So these things from of old, they go back at least as far as his fathers. So their ancestors. It sounds like some point in human history, right? So the truth being spoken by Asaph is that old. Matthew says that Jesus was speaking truths much more ancient than that. Verse 35 in Matthew, I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. That's the phrase Matthew uses. That is a very big change. You go from of old to from the foundation of the world. One probably refers to just some point in human history. This refers to the very beginning of the world. So that's a very, very big change. Now, I think it's pretty easy to see why Matthew would do that. It's because when Jesus does this, he actually does teach about truth far more ancient. Asaph in Psalm 78 is largely discussing the history of God's dealings with Israel. If you go and you read that psalm, that is the chief storyline of Psalm 78. He is rehearsing God's dealings with Israel, specifically Israel's rebellions against God. So that's what he's talking about. Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is talking about the plan that God has had for the entire world from the very beginning, before he even started creating, the preordained plan of God that is now finally being brought to fruition. That's Jesus' subject matter. That is a lot more ancient than what Asaph is talking about, which makes Jesus a better prophet, right? I mean, Asaph goes back so far, hey, let me tell you about God's dealing with our own people. Jesus says, let me tell you about what God has for you from the foundation of the world. He can go back further. He can go back further in the past and bring it out into the present. In all these ways, you see Matthew portray Jesus as being better than Asaph. He tells more parables, he tells them more forcefully, and he is more ancient in the truth that he is revealing. That's what I mean by that. So Matthew, he comes in here, he very much changes the wording of the Old Testament passage, but all of his changes, when you think about them, they have meaning. And when you think about them, you see what that meaning is. So I think it's just a further argument, further ways of subtly implying that Jesus has out-profited the prior prophets. He has done more, certainly more than Asaph ever did. We can at least say that. So that was the last thing I wanted to say on this. Now, as a matter of concluding here, let me just summarize. I call this puzzles for the people of God. Why? Because now you see prophets, they usually speak in that way. Jesus certainly does with his parables. So if you're part of the people of God, you should not be offended when you get unclear revelation. It is typically supposed to be that way. And Jesus certainly followed in those footsteps. Now Matthew's point was that this parabolic kind of teaching that Jesus was doing is actually part of Jesus' messianic credentials. This is actually part of the thing that makes Jesus the Messiah. And point one in this was that Jesus' manner of teaching could have raised a strong objection from the Jews. They would have not liked it. They would have been deeply insulted in many different ways, and I went through all those ways that the Jews could have been insulted at all these parables. Matthew, of course, is required to answer this. If he's going to make an argument that Jesus is the Messiah, he needs to deal with those problems. Secondly, Matthew's answer depended upon this fact that Hebrew prophets very often taught God's people in unclear ways. They very often come to the people of God with these very riddlesome type revelations that don't make a whole lot of sense at first, but eventually do. So I showed you several Old Testament examples of that. And then point three, Matthew uses Psalm 78 to answer possible objections and describe more Old Testament fulfillment. So he turns this objection around into an argument that Jesus is the Messiah. When Jesus speaks in parables, he is just following the Old Testament standard for unclear prophetic speech, just as Asaph was doing in Psalm 78, just as any number of prophets were doing back in the Old Testament. Jesus just follows the standard operation for a prophet. The fact that he does this better than Asaph is what makes his parables a sign of his messiahship. That's how he fulfills the idea of Psalm 78. Finally, we talked about how Matthew words this quotation in such a way to emphasize the superiority of Jesus to Asaph. All these different changes that he makes to the way the quotation is worded, all of those have meaning, and they very subtly imply the superiority of Jesus. Now, I said again at the beginning of this message that Matthew shows a greater attention to these kingdom parables than other gospel authors. Mark and Luke don't care so much. John doesn't care at all about the parables of Jesus because he records none of them. Well, Matthew cares so much because they're so important for his purpose. You see here, as you study these parables and what they mean in the greater light of Old Testament revelation, this is part of the argument that Jesus really is from God, which is why Matthew puts a lot of weight on these parables, why he gives you so many of them, why he provides you these explanatory passages for explaining the significance of these parables. Among other things, they are a sign that Jesus is the Messiah. They are part of the argument. They are an aspect of Jesus' messianic glory if you are willing to see it and not be offended at the fact that Jesus is dealing with you through parables. So you see Matthew's overall aim, I think, a little bit more clearly as he gives you these parables in Matthew 13. And that is all that I had to say on this. I found this passage very difficult, so if you have any questions, I am certainly willing to field them and do my best. Otherwise, any other comments people can make, that's fine too.